My voice, I don't know whether it's coming back. I did my first sound check about a month ago, and I didn't sound like me at all. I just couldn't believe that it's over.
For decades, they laughed at Barry Manilow. Critics built an entire architecture of contempt around his name. And while all of that was happening, Barry Manilow quietly sold 85 million records and became the only artist in the history of American music to chart in 6 consecutive decades. But at 82, Barry faced a battle no amount of fame could stop. Cancer came for him twice. The second time, it took his voice and left him in the ICU for 7 days. Fans feared the worst. What happened next stunned everyone. From a hospital bed, Barry Manilow made a decision that shocked the music world, and his message to millions left audiences in tears. This is what happened to Barry Manilow at 82. From Williamsburg to everything. Barry Allen Pincus was born on June 17, 1943, in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and the Williamsburg of 1943 was nothing like any version of the neighborhood that exists today. The Williamsburg of 1943 was tenements and fire escapes, and the smell of something frying in the apartment beside the apartment beside the apartment, because in that neighborhood, the walls between families were thin enough to hear every argument, every laugh, and every grief. His mother, Edna Manilow, worked as a stenographer. The family was Russian Jewish on her side, immigrants who had built a life in Brooklyn through the sheer refusal to believe the world owed them something easier. They were poor in the specific way that does not become charming in retrospect. Manilow described it decades later with the precision of someone who had never allowed himself the comfort of softening it. "Ask a cab driver to take you back there now," Manilow said in an interview, "and the driver will refuse." The street address of the beginning of Barry Manilow's life was not the kind of address that anyone looked back on with warmth. It was the kind that explained why a person worked the way Manilow worked for the rest of his life. The boy was shy, awkward by his own account, and not gentle about the description. He called himself the ugliest kid in school, without self-pity, but without softness either. The world had not yet given him a reason to trust it, and so he turned inward, the way children without friends have always done, and what he found inside that inwardness was music. At 7 years old, Barry Manilow began accordion lessons. It was the instrument available. The instrument that a family in Williamsburg could justify paying for without feeling the sacrifice was reckless. And Manilow practiced. He got good. He played for grandparents and family gatherings, and anyone who would sit still long enough to listen, and in those rooms where he played, something was confirmed that would never leave him. The people who heard him stopped whatever they were doing. They leaned forward. The music did something to the air in the room that nothing else could do. The boy from the Williamsburg tenement did not yet know what that something was. He would spend the next 75 years learning how to put it there deliberately. Before the accordion could carry the music as far as it needed to go, something arrived that changed the entire direction. Harold Kelleher was an Irish truck driver. Edna Manilow's Jewish family had barely tolerated the relationship from the start, but the family found a way to make it presentable. They went back through Harold's ancestry until they located a single Jewish relative from the 1800s, a great-uncle with the surname Pincus, and had Harold change his name to match. The marriage could then be presented with something resembling the respectability the family required. Barry Manilow describes the arrangement with a kind of dry clarity that never quite resolves into humor. They went back to the 1800s, he said, and found one Jewish uncle. The name changed immediately. It did not help. Harold Pincus, born Harold Kelleher, left before Barry was 2 years old. The family allowed no further contact. No visits, no explanations were offered to the boy, who would spend the rest of his life writing songs about longing, without ever quite explaining publicly where the longing came from or what its first name had been. Barry was raised by his mother and her parents, the Russian Jewish immigrants who understood endurance as the only philosophy available to people who had arrived with nothing and built something anyway. The money was thin, the world was tight, and in the middle of all of it, a boy grew up without a father and without the particular kind of security that comes from knowing there is someone in the house who is not going anywhere. When Barry was 12, his mother ran into an old friend on the subway. The friend was a man named Willie Murphy, an Irish truck driver who had known Harold Kelleher for years. Willie and Edna began seeing each other. They eventually married. The grandmother objected because that was what the grandmother did, but Willie Murphy turned out to be the thing Barry Manilow needed most at that specific moment in his life. Not money. Not a father figure in the conventional sense. Something more specific and more lasting. Willie Murphy came home with records. Not rock and roll, not the Bill Haley music sweeping through every other household in Brooklyn in the late 1950s. Manilow later confessed that early rock and roll left him completely cold, that it took the Beatles' arrival years later to convince him the genre had anything worth hearing. The records that changed everything. Willie Murphy's records were Sinatra, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Jerry Mulligan, Broadway cast albums from Carousel, Kismet, and The King and I. To a boy who had been playing accordion at family gatherings in Williamsburg, those records were a revelation with no adequate comparison. Manilow described the experience more than 60 years later with the same sense of something opening that he had felt the first time he heard those recordings as a child. Willie brought home a stack of albums that may as well have been a stack of gold, Manilow said, and changed life with just that little collection. Willie took the boy to see Jerry Mulligan play live at Town Hall in Manhattan. Manilow described it as a thunderbolt. Something cracked open that night. The understanding arrived that music was not entertainment and not a parlor performance for grandparents. Music was a living, breathing architecture of emotion, a structure a person could build a life inside of. The family bought a piano, an $800 Wurlitzer that represented a sacrifice the family could not easily afford but made anyway. Barry abandoned the accordion with relief and turned to the piano immediately, and the piano was the instrument the music in his head had been waiting for. Barry Manilow graduated from Eastern District High School in 1961 and enrolled at the New York College of Music before continuing to the Juilliard School, the most prestigious music conservatory in the United States, the place that trained the best of the best with a rigor and a seriousness that matched the level of ambition the boy from Williamsburg was beginning to understand that he carried. To pay his way through school, Manilow worked in the mailroom at CBS, sorting mail, learning the building, learning the people, watching how power moved through the corridors of one of the most influential broadcast networks in the country. He was 18 years old. He had come from a slum that cab drivers refused to visit. And every day, he was walking the halls of CBS, watching everything. The boy who had found music in a borrowed stack of records was now inside the institution that broadcast music to the nation. Everything after was preparation. The arrival was still a decade away. Before the first record, and before the first spotlight, and before Mandy, and before Copacabana, and before any of it, Barry Manilow spent a decade as the ghost in the machine of American commercial music. He wrote jingles. He wrote them with a craft and a commitment that the medium did not require, but that Manilow brought anyway, because craft was the only standard Manilow knew. The voice telling America that it deserved a break today at McDonald's was Barry Manilow. The arrangements underneath the Band-Aid jingle were by Barry Manilow. The Dr. Pepper commercial, the State Farm campaign, The music that accompanied a generation of Americans through their ordinary days in the late 1960s and early 1970s was built, in significant part, by a man whose name those Americans didn't know for years. He was present everywhere and credited nowhere. The invisible decade, as the music world calls it, was not invisible in its output. The jingles were brilliant. They were effective. They accomplished exactly the emotional and commercial function they were designed for. What they were not was a career of the kind Manilow understood was possible and necessary. In 1964, Manilow married his high school sweetheart, Susan Deixler. She was warm, steady, and supportive, the kind of person who believed in him when the evidence was thin. The marriage was genuine. The love was real. But Manilow was already somewhere else inside his own mind, already hearing the musical adventure that was pulling him away from everything that ordinary life required him to be. The marriage was annulled in 1966. Manilow carried the weight of that departure for the rest of his life. Not with bitterness, but with the specific honesty of someone who understood what had been sacrificed and what the sacrifice had cost another person who deserved better. The jingles continued. The invisible years continued. And underneath the commercial work, the musical intelligence that Juilliard had trained and Willie Murphy's records had first awakened was assembling itself into something that the jingle format was never going to be able to contain. The preparation was nearly complete. The room was coming. In 1971, a phone call arrived that placed Barry Manilow exactly where the next chapter of the story required him to be, in a basement on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, playing piano in a gay bathhouse for $75 a night. The room that nobody expected to matter turned out to be the room where everything began. The Continental Baths occupied the basement of the Ansonia Hotel on Broadway and 73rd Street, and in the years immediately following the Stonewall Uprising of 1969, the Continental Baths had become one of the most vital creative spaces in New York City. The audience in that room demanded authenticity above every other quality. These were gay men living in the specific moment when the gay community of New York had decided that hiding was finished and living was beginning, and they came to the Continental Baths for entertainment that matched the energy of that decision. He described it as simply a job. He needed the work, and the Continental Baths needed a piano player. The description was honest about the practical circumstances and modest about the significance of what actually happened in that basement across the months that followed. What happened was that two performers built something together in front of an audience that would not accept anything less than the complete truth of who a person was. Midler was constructing the divine Miss M persona, a character built on comedy and heartbreak, and the specific theatrical exuberance of someone who had decided to give everything to the room every single night. Manilow was behind the piano and behind the arrangements and behind the musical framework that made the performance coherent and devastating. Some nights, Manilow played in a white towel to match the audience, because formality in that room was the one thing that felt entirely wrong. Night after night, they built something neither of them had a name for yet. Manilow produced Midler's debut album, The Divine Miss M, in 1972. The album launched Midler to national fame and remains one of the essential recordings of that decade. The producer who made it happen stepped back into the shadows the moment the spotlight found the artist and waited. He was nearly 30 years old. He had never had a hit record. He had never once had the spotlight aimed in his direction. But he had spent a decade learning every room he walked into, learning what made music breathe, learning what made an audience stop talking and lean forward. The invisible years were almost over. Mandy and the Arrival. Nobody expected. Clive Davis had just founded Arista Records in 1974 when he called the pianist who had been working in the shadows of New York's music scene for a decade. Davis wanted to sign Barry Manilow. More than that, He wanted to make Barry Manilow a star. But first, Davis said, a career-making single was needed. Those were the exact words. Career-making single. Barry Manilow never forgot them. Davis sent over a recording, a moderately successful 1972 song by a British writer named Scott English, originally titled Brandy. The track had peaked briefly and faded. Most people had already forgotten it. But Davis heard something in the bones of the song, a longing and a reaching quality that could be transformed into something else entirely, with the right voice and the right arrangement. The name had to change. Looking Glass had already placed a different Brandy at #1 2 years earlier, and confusion would kill the single before it left the gate. The song was renamed Mandy. Barry Manilow recorded it in 1974. On January 18, 1975, Mandy reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was the first chart entry on any Billboard chart that Manilow had ever received. The first chart entry was #1. Barry Manilow was 31 years old. America had been hearing his voice for years without knowing it, in jingles and arrangements and the background music of ordinary daily life. Now, finally, it knew. What followed in the next several years was one of the most sustained commercial runs in the history of American popular music. Looks Like We Made It in 1976. Weekend in New England. Could It Be Magic? Can't Smile Without You. Copacabana at the Copa in 1978, a dramatic story song about a showgirl and a lost love that would win the Grammy Award for Best Male Pop Vocal Performance and become the most enduring anthem of a career that was already producing anthems at a rate the industry struggled to absorb. 13 #1s on the adult contemporary chart, 51 top 40 singles. 85 million records sold worldwide. Frank Sinatra, who did not offer praise casually, told the British press at the height of Manilow's popularity that Manilow was next. The man who had spent a decade invisible had arrived at a scale that even the people who had dismissed him could not explain away. The people who never stopped trying to explain him away were the critics, and what they said reveals something important about what Barry Manilow actually was. Rolling Stone spent years treating Barry Manilow as a punchline. The rock establishment built an architecture of dismissal around the name. Schmaltzy, critics wrote, bombastic, sentimental, a purveyor of music for middle-aged women who did not know any better. The contempt was specific and sustained. It was not the casual indifference of people who had not heard the music. It was the active, organized disdain of people who had heard the music and decided that its extraordinary popularity was itself evidence of failure, as though the tens of millions of people buying the records were simply demonstrating their own inadequacy. Barry Manilow did not fight them, did not chase their approval, did not reshape the sound to win their respect or compromise the emotional directness of the music to seem harder or cooler or more culturally appropriate for the era. He later described the philosophy with the directness of someone who had thought about it carefully and arrived at peace. The approach was deliberate. The goal was to stay out of sync with the times and simply do what felt good. What felt good, it turned out, felt good to a portion of the American public that dwarfed the combined readership of every publication that had written the contemptuous reviews. While critics were producing the dismissive profiles, ordinary people were playing Barry Manilow's records at weddings, on long drives home, in quiet moments when they needed to feel something they did not have words for themselves. That is what the music provided. Not sophistication, not cool. A vocabulary for feelings that people carried but could not always articulate. The specific, irreplaceable function of a song is that it says the thing the listener has been trying to say without knowing how to say it. The critics called this sentimentality. The audience understood it as the truth. The distinction is not small. Sentimentality is the performance of emotion that is not actually present. What Barry Manilow's music provided was the permission to feel emotion that was already there, but had nowhere to go. That is a different and considerably more difficult thing to manufacture. And the evidence that Manilow was doing it rather than merely performing it is the 85 million records that people chose to own and keep and return to across decades. The critics had their contempt. The audience had the music. The audience made a better investment, and behind the sold-out arenas and the platinum certifications and the Frank Sinatra endorsement, Barry Manilow was carrying a weight that none of those 85 million people knew about. The weight was a secret that took 36 years to put down. The secret he carried for 36 years. In 1978, at the absolute peak of his commercial fame, with his face on magazine covers and his songs on every radio station in the country, Barry Manilow met a television executive named Gary Keefe. The meeting was immediate and absolute. Manilow described it decades later without any performance of the memory. The understanding was instant. This was the person. Before that meeting, the hotel rooms after the shows had been empty. Night after night, after standing on a stage in front of thousands of people who had come specifically to be in the room where Barry Manilow was performing, the performer returned to a room where no one was waiting. Gary Keefe changed that. Keefe became the manager, then the partner, then the family that the boy from Williamsburg had built around the piano at CBS had never quite been able to produce. For 36 years, Barry Manilow kept that relationship hidden from the public. Not because the relationship was uncertain, not because Manilow doubted what it was, but because the career had been built in the 1970s on a connection with a fan base that was predominantly female, predominantly devoted, and that Manilow believed, with the sincerity of someone who had watched that base sustain the career through every critical dismissal, would feel betrayed by the truth of who the performer was. The concealment required constant management across 4 decades. The public persona maintained visible friendships with women. Rumors formed and dissolved. Manilow and Keefe lived together and worked together and built a life together inside the sharp glass house of a public celebrity and said nothing. In April of 2014, after same-sex marriage became legal in California, they married at their estate in Palm Springs. The guests, somewhere between 20 and 30 people, were told they were coming to lunch. They arrived and discovered they were attending a wedding. Manilow later said it with the honesty of someone for whom the experience had been larger than any public occasion. The depth of the emotion in that room was unexpected. 2 people who had spent 36 years not saying the full truth out loud, saying it in front of the people they loved most. The marriage became public in 2015. In April of 2017, on the cover of People magazine at the age of 73, Barry Manilow officially came out. He had carried the secret for nearly 4 decades. And the audience he had feared losing, the audience he had spent those decades protecting himself from, responded with the opposite of what he had dreaded. They were happy. They had been waiting for him to trust them with the truth all along. The International Theater at the Westgate, Las Vegas, sits in the same building, in the same room, where Elvis Presley had built the legendary residency that began in 1969 and ran until 1976. Elvis Presley performed 636 shows in that room across those years. No one had surpassed that number in the decades since. The room was the epicenter of a specific kind of American entertainment mythology, the place where the biggest name in popular music had stood night after night and given everything the performance required. On September 21st, 2023, Barry Manilow performed the 637th show in that room, one more than Elvis Presley. Manilow wore a red jacket with Elvis Presley's TCB lightning bolt logo stitched on the sleeve. He sang Hound Dog in tribute. The Westgate presented Manilow with the key to the Las Vegas Strip. And when the moment came to speak to the audience that night, the man who had outsold, outcharted, and now outperformed the greatest entertainer in the history of Las Vegas said exactly what he had always said in every room he had ever played across every decade of his career. It is all about the audience. The awards matter, Manilow told the crowd, but none of it would exist without the people in the seats. The Westgate responded to the record-breaking performance with an offer that had never been extended to anyone in the property's history. A lifetime residency, not a contract with renewal options and escalating fee structures. A lifetime residency for Barry Manilow in the room that had been his home and his stage, and the place where he had made, night after night, the case that the critics had spent decades denying. The founder of the property described it plainly. Manilow was a generational artist. The only appropriate arrangement was a permanent one. Barry Manilow accepted. That was supposed to be the shape of the final chapter, the lifetime residency in the perfect room. The record was broken. The career that had outlasted every dismissal and every trend, and every year that was supposed to be the last, arriving finally at the permanent home it had always deserved. Then came the bronchitis that would not resolve, then the MRI, then the spot on the left lung that the doctor described as something that needed to come out immediately. What the cancer took, and what he reached for anyway. Barry Manilow announced the lung cancer diagnosis on Instagram on December 22, 2025. The post was brief and direct. A bronchitis that had lingered for weeks. A doctor who paid close attention and ordered an MRI out of caution. A spot on the left lung was revealed by the imaging. Stage 1. Localized. No evidence of spread to the lymph nodes or anywhere else. The surgery was performed that same December, a lobectomy to remove the tumor. What followed was harder than anyone anticipated, including the patient. Post-surgical pneumonia developed. Barry Manilow spent 7 days in the intensive care unit. Then, in January 2026, the lung collapsed. The recovery that had already been extending beyond the expected timeline collapsed further. The actual healing, in the honest assessment of the medical team, began in February 2026. A full year, the doctors said, before everything would fully return. Manilow posted a selfie in January from a hospital bed in a green gown. 2 words in the caption, "Better today." In February 2026, the surgeon was direct about what the body was and was not ready to do. The lungs were not ready for performance. Multiple concert dates were postponed. Then more dates. Then more again. The return to Las Vegas that had been planned for February did not happen. The March dates did not happen. The April arena shows did not happen. The May Las Vegas shows were postponed. The voice that had carried 85 million records, that had survived throat cancer at 77 and returned stronger, that had sung Copacabana and Mandy and I Write the Songs in sold-out arenas for half a century, was uncertain. Manilow described the experience of the first sound check after surgery with the specific honesty of someone who did not have the comfort of softening it. The voice at that sound check did not sound like itself. That was his description. It did not sound like him at all. He was not certain it was coming back. On June 1, 2026, in an interview with Good Morning America, Manilow delivered the assessment that had been forming across the months of recovery. The voice was getting closer. The body was in good shape. The uncertainty was real and present and was being lived with daily. His first concert since the surgery is scheduled for June 25, 2026, in Reading, Pennsylvania. The Las Vegas residency is scheduled to run from May through December 2026. And on June 5, 2026, Barry Manilow releases What a Time, his 33rd studio album and his first record of almost entirely original material in 15 years. Executive produced in part by Clive Davis, the same man who sent him the song called Brandy in 1974 and told him he needed a career-making single. 52 years later, they are still working together. The single Once Before I Go has already reached the top 10 on the adult contemporary chart, making Manilow the only artist in the history of that chart to score a hit in 6 consecutive decades. 6 decades, from 1974 to 2026. The boy from Williamsburg with the borrowed name and the stepfather's stack of records. The new album, What a Time, reflects the fullness of that arc. 13 songs. Collaborators include Babyface Edmonds, Gary Barlow, and longtime partner Michael Lloyd. Music made by an 82-year-old man who spent 7 days in an ICU and came back to the recording studio because the alternative to making the music was not something Barry Manilow was built to accept. A boy from a Brooklyn tenement. Years of writing hits behind the scenes. A secret carried for 36 years, 7 days in the ICU, and a voice he still isn't sure will fully return. Yet Barry Manilow is still creating, still performing, and still looking ahead. Like this video, subscribe for more incredible stories, and let us know your thoughts below. Thanks for watching.